Welcome to the Bread of Life channel. I'm so thrilled to have Grace here with me today. She's going to be sharing some of her journey of faith. And so, Grace, do you want to start by telling us a little bit about your background and your family?
Sure. Hi, Rebecca. It's really great to be here today. Thank you for the invitation. I actually became a follower of Christ at age 15. I had a friend who invited me to church one night and told me that Jesus loved me and wanted to have a relationship with me. And I don't know why that just resonated so deeply, but it did. And I prayed with him that night, and the most powerful thing happened for me. And that was, here was this 15-year-old kid who knew that they had done, lots of things that shouldn't have been done. And if they were known, I was just certain that, people would not want me around, would not want me in their lives. That was certainly the kind of sense I was getting from my parents. But when I was introduced to Jesus, the thing that stood out to me was that here is someone, and I don't even know how I knew this, but here is someone who knows everything I've done and is still telling me that they love me and wants to be part of my life. And that was just transformative for me. It was a short period after that I received a call to ministry and spent the next 4 years training, and 32 years after that, pastoring with the Assemblies of God in the Bay Area of California. During all of that time, well, actually, my wife and I actually were sweethearts even before I became a follower of Christ. She was 14, and we had started hanging out together a few months before that moment of salvation. And we eventually, after 5 years, getting old enough, got married and just celebrated our 47th wedding anniversary this past Monday.
Wow, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. We have 3 kids, 3 amazing kids. Our oldest is a daughter. I have 2 sons, both of whom are gay. And that was a challenging experience for us, being pastors with the Assemblies of God, and helped us to go on quite a long journey of discovering, what does the Bible actually say about LGBTQ identities. For a long time, we were in this place of just simply saying, I don't know. And that's not because the scripture seems to be unclear on this topic, only because the way it describes the topic did not match up what I was seeing in my sons. And so, for example, in Romans chapter 1, there is this kind of scathing indictment of out of control sexual activity, first by heterosexual folks and then by folks engaging in same-sex behavior. And it's this orgiastic kind of out of control licentious picture. And one of the phrases in there says that these folks gave up relations with the opposite sex in order to engage in relations with the same sex. And I'm looking at my sons and saying, they don't look like that at all. They aren't engaged in any of that kind of activity. They have never given up anything from their earliest moments. They've only ever been attracted to the same sex. They're not licentious. They aren't involved in illicit sex. So we looked at that passage and said, well, there's something there, but it certainly doesn't describe our boys. And so our decision was just simply to say, we don't know. One thing we did know is that the Bible does tell us to love our neighbor as ourselves, and nobody seems to argue with that one. So that's where we decided to land and spent the next 20 years in that I don't know place. Until eventually, I decided that that's unfair to them for reasons I'll speak about in a minute, because it didn't really address a core issue that they needed to know, and that is, how does God really feel about them? All they knew is that they couldn't be sure based on what we were telling them. And I wanted them to know without a doubt that God loved them unconditionally, received them and welcomed them. And so I went on my own journey of trying to figure out, what does the Bible say about this? Honestly, I was terrified of that journey because I was afraid that we might have to come down on the side that required us to do damage to our relationship with our boys. But thankfully, that wasn't the case. And we're grateful to be able to be in an affirming place today, loving them unconditionally and still helping them to try and understand that that's how God sees them as well.
Wow. And so we haven't really talked about how this is actually, you were living as a man all of that time. So your gender journey began later in life. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, you obviously picked up on the dissonance in my story of marrying somebody and being married 47 years, being a pastor, and everybody knows there's no possible way you can be a transgender woman in an Assemblies of God church. That wouldn't fly at all. So yes, at the age of 61, let me back up and say that all of my life I had experienced this desire to dress as a woman. I'd never given much expression to it. And then when I became a follower of Christ at age 15, all of the messages that I was receiving at that point was that, oh, this would not be good. This would not be right. God would not be happy with that. And so, I love Jesus and I want to follow him, the very best way that I can. So I followed those messages and, to the best of my ability, tried not to give in to that desire. There were a few times along the way where I'd slip on some women's clothing and immediately be overcome with guilt and rip it off and get on my knees and repent. And it might be another 10 years before I might engage that again. Well, here was one of those moments where this time I'm 61. I'm thinking I've never fully done this. Let me just dress fully as a woman one time. Let me get it out of my system. Okay. Move on from there. Well, I wasn't prepared for what happened when I took a look in the mirror. And I call it a revelation. Some of my friends call it a homecoming. For me, it was kind of like, I don't know if you've ever been out on a beach or in a mountain area, and the sun starts to come up, and there's a certain point at which it starts to peak above the horizon, and the next second there's just this bright flood of light, and that's what it felt like for me as I stood there looking in the mirror and said, oh my goodness, this is who I am. And in the same moment, the very next thought was, I must be absolutely crazy. Who has ever looked at themselves and said, I'm a girl living in a man's body? This is 2016. I don't know how this is possible, but it is God's truth. I had never heard the word transgender. I did not know there was a conversation going on about it in the culture. I did not know that Bruce Jenner had become Caitlyn Jenner. I did not know any of that. When I'm standing there looking at myself in the mirror, it wasn't from some kind of pre-knowledge that this was going on or being talked about in the culture. It was an internal revelation that just made sense and connected so many dots in a long life that never seemed to quite fit with, I guess, what I expected it to be. I never quite fit with boys. I didn't know how to relate to them. Over the course of time, I would memorize certain things about how to be a boy, and I could demonstrate that back again, but it just never felt right to me. I always seemed to have a lot more feminine tendencies. My wife and I would go to these marriage seminars, and in those days, there was always this attempt to really exaggerate gender differences at that point. And we would walk out of those conferences, and she can testify that I shared this with her more than one time. I would come out and say, well, I guess we know who the woman is in our relationship, don't we? I was connecting with so many of the qualities, patterns, and ways of relating that I was hearing about from the women's side, and it just felt so right. Again, I really can't explain what happened that day, but I knew in my core that this is who I am, and now I had to figure it out. That was the impetus for finally going back to the scripture. And I'm actually ashamed that it took my own recognition of being transgender before I had enough courage to go back and really delve into what does the Bible say about LGBTQ identities. It feels so selfish at this point. Why couldn't I have loved my boys deeply enough to make that study? All I can say is I was afraid that I might have to push our relationship farther away, and I couldn't take that risk. Now there was no choice. I had to figure this out. I had to know if I could continue to follow Jesus and love him and serve him, or whether or not, I just had to conclude that I was going to hell, and that's all there is to it. Well, I'm very grateful to say that I love Jesus more than I ever have. I feel so accepted and loved by him. My favorite passage of scripture is Psalm 139, where it talks about us being fearfully and wonderfully made. And when I read that passage, I know in my soul that God made me who I am, that he delights in me, and that my best expression of service to him is going to come by being the woman that he created me to be. So my story is a lot different than most. I didn't know when I was 3 years old or 5 years old or 15 or 25. I never would have even conceived of the possibility, because I didn't know there was such a thing. I didn't have language for it. All I knew is things internally didn't fit, and I did my best to make them fit for 61 years. Now I don't have to try hard to make things fit. I can just be me. And gosh, I have to tell you, life is so different now that I have accepted that I am trans and have started to move through the world that way. I have friendships now that are so deep and vulnerable, the kinds of friendships that I coveted throughout my entire life and never was able to form. I tried to do it with men, and it just didn't work. I couldn't do it with women because I'm married and I'm a man, and there's too much danger, in that possibility. So I spent my life in this no man's land, and literally at the time that I was 61, there wasn't a single person other than family that I could have said, would show up in a pinch if I needed help, that I could call in the middle of the night, or if I was going through a difficult time, that I could actually share what was really going on for me. And now I have scores of friends like that. And it is the most amazing experience. I didn't know life could be this good.
Wow, that's beautiful. Well, so since you first started presenting publicly 2 years ago, and since then you've gotten involved in a number of ways to support the queer community. So can you tell us what you've been doing?
So my first experience of presenting publicly was almost 2 years ago at a Reformation Project conference. And that's where I first began to meet people that I have eventually become deep friends with. It's the first time in all of my experience as a human being going to a conference and sharing contact information and actually staying in contact and maintaining and building friendships since that time. Well, the Reformation Project is involved in helping churches have the conversation about LGBTQ inclusion. And with my pastoral background for 32 years in a conservative evangelical denomination, and also my experience of having 2 gay sons and my own personal experience of being trans, it feels like there's an intersection between in that conversation that helps me, that I'm uniquely suited for. And so I've been engaging with the Reformation Project and trying to help advance that conversation through that organization and also individually in my own church that I attend. By the way, I should mention that I currently only present as Grace maybe about a quarter of the time. And that only in conferences where I travel as Grace, and then in situations like this where I'm upstairs in my in our bonus room, and I have my computer and everything all set up here, and so I spend a lot of time up here during the course of a given week, engaging with folks, helping with the Reformation Project. I help co-lead a group for parents of LGBTQ kids. I am on the parent team for Q Christian Fellowship and help plan an annual conference. I'm a board member, a founding board member with Affirming Therapy, which is a foundation for raising funds so that LGBTQ people who can't afford therapy can get that. And we're connected with a group called the Christian Closet, run by Candace Subernat, which is a fabulous organization for offering counseling, staffed entirely by members of the queer community. What else am I doing? I lead book clubs from time to time to try to advance this conversation. And basically anywhere I go and whoever's willing to listen, I want to have this conversation because I feel like the more we talk about this, the more we normalize the fact that LGBTQ people are simply people trying to live their lives, to be happy, just like anyone else of us, and who have the capacity, and sometimes the really deep capacity, to love Jesus and love people in ways that sometimes, those who haven't walked this road are unable to do. When you've experienced so much rejection, so much pushback against who you are, and you know how deeply hurtful that is, one of the things you want to do is make sure that no one feels that from you. And so I like to move into situations with my arms and my heart wide open to welcome in anybody. And I don't even care if they don't like me. I want to at least lead with love in hopes that, that becomes more of the way in which we have this conversation instead of the polarized way in which it's going on in the country at this point.
Yeah, and speaking of that, we know that there are people out there who are just like you were, wrestling with these feelings and like not having words to describe what they're going through, or just not sure if Jesus will accept them, and in the way that they truly are, whether they're gay or trans, or any other letter on the LGBTQ community. So,
and having no one to talk to about it.
Yeah.
One of the things that I find really hopeful and really encouraging is when I get a chance to talk to someone who's just beginning this journey for themselves, and I can offer them hope and encouragement. I love the fact that I get to be in groups with parents who have trans kids, because so often they don't necessarily know any other trans people. And if they do, it feels a little bit awkward, kind of asking the questions. But I just like to put myself out there and say, if I can help illuminate the experience that your child is having, recognizing that everyone's experience is different. The phrase, if you've seen one trans person, you've seen one trans person, really applies because everybody's experience is different. But there are some commonalities, and oftentimes parents just being able to see someone who's thriving as a trans person gives them a lot of hope for what can be possible for their children. So I love being in those environments and just being an open book, if you will, to help people navigate this journey, and especially this journey with Jesus.
Yeah, and in this video, we're really talking about your personal journey, but for those who may be struggling, we're not really in this video going into like how you uh discovered kind of rediscovered the Bible and what it has to say about this issue. But that if you're someone who is that's the answer you're looking for, then we do want to kind of guide you to the resources that will help you. And as you mentioned, the Reformation Project, and we just want to say go to the Reformation Project. They have a reformationproject.org, and you will find help there. You'll find resources. You can get in contact and just start being in contact with Christians who have had this experience that you're going through and who are fighting for affirmation. Okay, so there are resources out there. Is there anything else you might want to say to somebody who might be struggling in some way with their gender identity or sexual orientation?
Well, let me talk a little bit about some of the things that God's revealed to me on this
Okay.
journey, and things
Mhm.
that, and particularly something that was mind blowing that I learned about Jesus. And it was a short while into this, I would say about 4 months after that Reformation Project experience, that I was sitting down one day reading through Matthew chapter 7. This is the last chapter of the Sermon on the Mount. And if you can picture it, you've got this massive group of people sitting on a hillside with Jesus talking to them. And for whatever reason, the thought crossed my mind, what would it have been like if I could have sat there in that group and listened to these words from Jesus for the very first time, without any of the commentaries, without any of the centuries of discussion about these verses, without what I had learned in Bible college and so forth. I'm just sitting there listening, and what would I hear? I also imagined that for most people, I don't know if you've done this, but when I go to church, a lot of times I'm praying a prayer along the lines of, Lord, please talk to me today. Share something with me that will help me to follow you better, to love better, whatever it might be. And oftentimes there may be a need that I'm carrying in. And so I'm really desperate to hear something that makes a difference. And then I started imagining, being LGBTQ is not a new phenomenon. It's been going on from the beginning of time. What if there were parents there who were thinking about some things they were noticing in their kids? And what if those kids were sitting there listening to Jesus and they're noticing things internally and knowing it's not lining up with what seems to be happening with their peers? With all of that in mind, I started reading in Matthew 7, and right at verse 7, it says, ask and you'll receive, seek and you'll find, knock and the door will be open to you. And I'm just imagining the prayers of these parents, because I am the parent of a gay child. I have prayed, Lord, how do I love my child well? And now as a transgender person, I have prayed, how can I serve you? How can I make my life count? How can I get people to accept that I'm not crazy, that I'm just another human being like everyone else? So there's some desperate questions going on there. And Jesus, if you stop and think about it, is only going to be there this one time. He's not pastoring a church. He's an itinerant preacher. He's stopped by and everybody's come out to listen to him. He gets one shot at telling them something that's going to make a difference. And I just remember weeping as I realized how powerfully he was able to answer every person's need in that moment in such a simple and profound way. The very next thing he says is, parents, if you have a child who asks you for bread, will you give him a stone? If they ask you, will you give them a snake? And then Jesus makes this amazing statement where he says, even though you are evil, if you know how to give good gifts to your children, actually, let me phrase it better the way the scripture actually says it. If you know how to give good gifts to your children, even though you're evil, even though you're not perfect, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? And I'm sitting there listening to Jesus empower parents in a way I've never, because I've not heard commentary on this before. I'm listening to this for the first time with fresh ears. I don't have any preconceived ideas. I'm a parent. I'm hearing Jesus tell me, you've got this. Your child's asking you for something. You know what they need. Where did you get that? You got that from your Father in heaven. You can trust yourself. You can trust yourself to get this right. Oh my gosh. When I was trying to relate to my gay sons as a pastor, I totally did not trust myself. I didn't know what to believe, how to feel, how to respond to them. And here is Jesus telling me, trust yourself. You've got this. You love your kids. You know what they need. And then he says the thing that just blew me away. I think it's the thing that got him crucified. He said, so, given who you are, given who your Father is and how close you are in the ways that you relate to your kids, whatever you would have others do to you, do to them. Because this fulfills all of the law and the prophets. Whatever you want from your parents, give it to the people around you. And you will be fulfilling everything that God has ever written down, ever will command. You'll fulfill all of the law and the prophets. And again, I'm hearing this for the first time. And this is before the Spirit has even been given, and yet Jesus is still believing in people that they're able to do this. He's saying to them, you don't need a pastor to tell you what to do. You don't even need the Torah to tell you what to do. Not that these are bad things, and not that you shouldn't consult them and care about their wisdom. But frankly, if you can figure out what love looks like to you, and give that away to others, that's what the Bible is all about. That's what the second command is all about. In fact, it's what both commands are: love God and love your neighbor as yourself. The two cannot be separated from one another. Love for God is love for neighbor. And if you don't love your neighbor, John says you don't love God. And so here was this moment of revelation, telling me that I could trust myself as a parent, I could trust my love, and that Jesus even was confident enough in me that I could figure out what it would mean, what it might look like to love my neighbor. I can tell you what it doesn't look like to love LGBTQ people. I can tell you when you tell them they're abominations, that when you tell them that God hates them, that not hates them, but hates them, if hates the sin, that doesn't separate a whole lot, because when you don't have a choice about who you are, to be told that God hates sin is essentially to be told that God hates you, because you don't really have a choice. And I can also tell you what love looks like. When I sit down with someone and I ask them to tell me their story, and they know that I'm not going to judge them, that I'm going to embrace them, that I'm going to tell them how beautiful and valuable and how deeply loved they are and unconditionally loved by God, you can see their face light up. You can see the burden lift. It's not hard to tell what love
Yes.
looks like, but we've been taught so long not to trust ourselves that we don't even trust our love. That was the massive thing that Jesus taught me as I was reading that his sermon that day, is that I
Wow.
believe in you. I believe in you to get this right. And why? Because you're made in the image of your Father, and he's like that. That was one big thing.
Wow.
The other big thing was about Jesus himself. And I actually started to read how Jesus engaged with people. And it blew me away that never once did Jesus ever lead with, "You're wrong. This isn't right. These decisions that you've made have wrecked your life." Never once does he even say a word about that. He always leads with, "How can I help you? How can I show you that you matter to me?" And in the one place where he actually mentions sin and suggests that maybe we shouldn't do it anymore, it's after he's already said, "I don't condemn you. It doesn't matter. This is the woman caught in adultery." And if I've heard it once, I've heard it 1,000 times. That one sentence at the end as she's walking away, when he says, "Neither do I condemn you, go and sin no more." That becomes the model of how Jesus responds to everybody, by being able to say to him, "But look, Jesus was telling her not to sin." Well, I don't even think he needed to say it, because it's pretty clear that her sin had just about gotten her stoned. It's the only time in any of Jesus's encounters when he calls people to account for their sin, except when he's talking to religious leaders.
Yeah.
And he rakes them over the coals like nobody's business.
Yes.
It is dramatic. And for 32 years as a pastor, I thought my job was to fix people, correct people, tell them what the Bible said. And I wasn't doing it maliciously. I honestly believed that that's what love required of me. When I look at the life of Jesus, I don't see him even having those conversations with people. I see him listening to where they've been hurt, how they've been burdened, how they're sick, how they're in need. And he steps into their lives and he feeds them and he heals them and he tells them, you matter to me. I love you. And so I started not having to move into people's lives to correct anything. I just needed to show up the way Jesus did, and say, if there's something I have that I can help with, it's yours. I feel like I finally have good news to share with people. It's not just that salvation is a free gift, and once you get it, now we bring out the rules and you better live by them, otherwise you might have this gift yanked away. It's salvation is a free gift, and so is the unconditional love of Jesus. And if we stumble along the way, oh well.
Yes.
We're loved unconditionally, and we can do that for others. Anyway, some really life-changing moments for me that have completely changed the way I move into people's lives. And honestly, I can see the fruit. It's far different.
Yes. Wow, that is really beautiful. So it's so interesting to me that you had that experience for more than 30 years. You were preaching every week. You probably knew the Bible backwards and forwards, but it seems like you had a new experience with Jesus. Was it like rediscovering a joy that you had found from the past, or like what was it like to preach for all those years and then to come to this new revelation?
Like I said, it was like I finally understood what the good news was all about. As a pastor, one of the things I absolutely hated doing was, quote, telling people the truth. I used to say that I'd rather do a funeral than a wedding. And the reason why is because at a funeral, I get to talk about who God is. I get to talk about what he's done for us. I get to talk about all of the ways in which he's demonstrated his love through Jesus Christ. The life is lived, the decisions are made. There's no questions. Family may wonder, well, is this person going to heaven or not? Not my call. But I do know the character and love of God, and I can share that at a funeral, and I can talk about the ways in which a person's life has touched others, and we can laugh and cry and hug and remember together. On the other hand, when people come to me to get married, I almost always have to tell them no. Are you divorced? Oh my goodness. Was it for adultery? No. Okay, I can't marry you. Are you living together? Oh, well, then you've got to stop, living together before I can marry you. I can't tell you how many times I would get calls for weddings, and in order to follow the guidance that I was told to follow, supposedly biblically based, I had to crush people by telling them their pastor couldn't do their wedding. And I hated it. I absolutely hated it. Yeah, what else can I say?
Wow.
Now I get to say to them, God loves you. You've got this. You want to follow Jesus? He's already paid the price for you. There's nothing that stands in the way of you having a relationship with him. Are you going to be perfect? No, you don't have to be. Do you want to love him? Do you want to love people? Do we want to try to get better at it as we move through life? All right, let's do that. We can do that together. I often said that if I started a church today, that we'd have only one command and there'd be only one mission statement. The command would be love your neighbor as yourself. And the mission statement is everyone is my neighbor. And we would come together every week and we would talk about who our neighbors are and how can we love them better. And we would go out into the world and do exactly what Jesus told us to do, which is love one another as I have loved you. It's so amazing to me. I did not see that in 32 years of pastoral work. There are 9 different times by all of the gospel writers, by Paul, by Peter, by James, where the Bible says in one way or another, love your neighbor as yourself because this fulfills all of the law and the prophets. I especially love James's rendition of it. Where he says, if you fulfill the royal law, which is love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. Period. Full stop. End of sentence. And it's like, if you want to take the Bible literally, well, then read that passage because it's pretty clear about what God considers to be right. Oh, it's amazing. And then, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, and so on. And then the last sentence that almost always gets left off. There's no law against such things. There are no bounds or boxes on love. I can love anybody I want. I can love them however they need to be loved. And I am moving in the direction of the Spirit. There is no law against such things. Yes, some completely different revelations, if you will, along the path that have totally freed me up to move into anyone's life with care and compassion and love, because I know that's how God is moving into their lives. I mean, he proved that when he sent Jesus.
Yes. So beautiful. Well, so you just celebrated 47 years of marriage and 52 years that you've been with your wife. So a couple years before you got married. So what has it been like for you and Cindy the last 7 years?
It has been hard. Obviously, neither one of us anticipated this day. And I will say that this particular relationship, our marriage, has been the most difficult to discern what it means to love your neighbor as yourself. One of my favorite passages is Romans 13:10, which says, "Love does no harm to its neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfillment of the law." That has given me a brand new definition of what sin is. I don't have a long list anymore. I only have one statement that tells me what sin is, and that is doing harm to a neighbor. Love does no harm to a neighbor. And so, one of the things that we've been trying to sort through in our marriage is this harmful, this living as a woman. I can definitely say that it's been hard and that it has caused lots of hurt, lots of disappointment, and lots of anguish. We both love each other deeply and want to figure out a way forward. Some would look at me and say, well, the way forward is go back to the way it used to be. Just continue to live your life as a man. That's who she married. And yes, I theoretically could do that. And that would be enormously harmful to me. I would not be able to thrive. It would be impossible for me to be doing what I'm doing right now and to be the person I am right now, to have the kinds of vulnerable and close friendships that I have right now, to do the work that I'm doing right now, which I believe God has led me to do, were I to put that all aside and try to go back and fit back into that put that square peg in the round circle. It just wouldn't work. And so as we've both come to recognize that that's the case, we've been trying to figure out a way forward. In the beginning, it was, I can give expression to this quietly at home. But that wasn't working. It did for a season, but it wasn't working because I was constantly switching in and out of this male and female persona. My wife, out of respect for her, I've never actually presented as female in front of her. So she, in order to enable us to continue on together, all the things that I've been doing largely in private. When I travel to conferences, she doesn't go with me. When I'm having these gatherings in my bonus room, she's never been a part of one. And so that's part of the way that we've tried to navigate this. And we call that our shared sacrifice. For her part, she sacrifices the time that I spend as Grace. Why does she allow me to do it? Because she can see the difference that it's made in me as a person and even how we relate together. There's so much more that I bring to our relationship now that I was unable to bring before. And so she's been willing to accept a portion of my life being lived as Grace. And then I, on the other hand, have been accepting the fact that in the times when I'm with her and in spaces where she frequents, then I'm presenting as her husband. And that's worked pretty well for us. The gender dysphoria, that sense of dissonance inside of where I'm my insides are mismatched with my body, that's almost completely gone. And so that, solving that problem was what we were really shooting for, was what's the minimum we can do to be able to calm down the gender dysphoria and still be able to function together, as a married couple. And up until about 3 months ago, I would have told you that it's enough. But then an interesting thing happened. And one of the differences, the way I kind of describe my life right now is that my life as Grace is filled with friendships and relationships and ministry and caring and compassion and things that light me up every day and that I feel like bring God pleasure. And then on the other hand, there is my life with Cindy, which is a life that's filled with a lot of fear for her, and rightfully so. She doesn't know what might happen if the neighbors around discovered that I was transgender. She doesn't know what might take place if our church family discovered that I was transgender. There's so much that she stands to lose if who I am becomes known, that she lives in sort of this constant fear. And so I respect that, and I try not to take risks that might expose me to those that she knows. But there's a cost to that, because it means that there are whole parts of my life now that are scary to her, that it's difficult for her to want to be curious about. And the thing that I've noticed is that the more I lean into building friendships and relationships as Grace, the more ministry work that I do in that arena, the less and less time there is, for our relationship. So I see one side of my life expanding, another side of my life shrinking, and my wife is suffering. That's just not good. But the big thing that really struck out for us is I thought, well, then I need to start giving more time to building friendships and relationships on my married side. And so we decided to try to become friends with a couple at church. And we weren't able to get together with them as a couple, but we were able to get together. I was able to get together with the husband. Now recognize I'm meeting him as a man. And so that's how our relationship is going forward. And I'm trying to engage with him the way that I engage with people as Grace. Just kind of this openness, sharing, vulnerable, talking about what's going on in my life, wanting that level of friendship. If I'm going to invest the time, I don't want to just have a golf buddy. I don't just want to have, a couple who, it's nice to go out to dinner with them. I want people that know who I am. And I got about 2/3 of the way through that conversation and realized I can't go any farther than this. All I can do is tell them about what I'm doing and let them assume that I'm doing it as a man. But I can't tell them what I'm actually doing. I can't talk to them about any of the other friendships that I have. I can't talk to them about what's really going on in my life. They will never be anyone that I can call in a pinch and have any kind of confidence that I can count on them, because they won't know, and they never can know. And that's when I realized that this shared sacrifice that we have is a dead end. There's no way to make it live. And so Cindy and I began to talk about, what that really looks like, and have both recently come to the conclusion that based on who we are and what we need in respectively in our marriage, that it's best that we separate at this point and just see what happens at that point. It's not something either of us wanted. She asked me yesterday, how are we doing? And I said, and she echoed, I love you. I don't want this to be happening, but I don't see any other way forward. And she also echoed that same thing. So that is our new season that we're about to enter into, to determine whether or not there's a possibility that being apart lets us know how much we absolutely need to be together, and whether or not we can do that as with me as a woman and her as herself. We won't know that until we try it. I'm still desperately hoping we can find a way where we don't have to cross that threshold. And actually, that's one of the things that I'm looking forward to doing in the future. Is as this conversation grows and it becomes more and more safe for people to talk about what their actual experience is in churches, there are going to be a lot more couples going through what we're going through, because one spouse or the other will decide it's finally safe to say, this is what's going on for me, and has been. A lot of these couples were encouraged to marry because there was the belief that if you married someone of the opposite sex, that you would develop feelings and desire for them. And when that hasn't happened, couples either leave the church and divorce, or it's just very few people are actually able to make marriages work once that becomes known. I keep having this naive feeling. I call it naive because I don't know. I keep having this desire that there has to be a way forward. There's going to be more and more of these marriages kind of coming out and being made aware of in churches and so on. And right now, our churches are completely ill-equipped to offer any kind of support. We haven't told our pastor what we're about to do because we don't know what that means for us. Will he still continue to care for us the way that he has, or will this be, one step too far? The Jesus that I know doesn't have any steps too far to take. He just moves in and cares, regardless of what the situation is, and kind of helps us find, our footing and find a way forward. So, at this point, we're handling it among ourselves and with whatever support we can get outside of our church. But as the church continues to have this conversation, there needs to be ways of supporting couples. And so I want to lean into discovering what that might be and talk to other couples. And maybe there are those out there who have actually been able to make this work. What is it? What did they learn? What worked for them? And so that's kind of what I'm leaning toward in my future. And then one other thing, recently we attended church with our daughter. Again, I was presenting as a man, so nobody was any the wiser. We went to church with them for the first time. They'd only been there for a month, and the pastor that was speaking that day was unfamiliar to them, one of the associate pastors. He proceeded to get up and labeled transgender people as pedophiles and perverts. And then he walked it back a bit and said, well, I don't want to paint this with a broad brush, and so only some of them are pedophiles and perverts. The implication being most. He then proceeded to walk through each letter of the LGBTQ alphabet, and for good measure decided to throw in Hindus, Muslims, and Buddhists as well. And then his pièce de résistance was, and by the way, God is disgusted with all of you too because of all of your sin, and if it weren't for Jesus, he wouldn't even be able to give you the time of day. I know that's not true because Jesus came from heaven to earth and walked among us and didn't seem to have any problems. I know it because he sat with a group of Pharisees as a prostitute came in and washed his feet with her hair, didn't say one word about her sin, but did tell them she would be remembered forever for this sacrifice and gift that she was giving to him. That's the Jesus that I know. That's not the Jesus that was being preached that day. And it made me realize all the more that this man, who, not a bad man, doing the very best he could do with what he's been taught and trained to do, who did not know me from Adam, was speaking things about who I am without ever knowing who I am. It was clear to me that he did not know any transgender people. It was clear to me that he did not know that he had transgender people in his service that day. It was clear to me that he did not know that there were parents with gay kids in the service that day who would be absolutely terrified to even mention that possibility after hearing a message like that. The hardest part for me was that after each group was consigned to hell, the congregation erupted with applause. I was sitting with my family. My 16-year-old granddaughter, who does not know that I'm trans, was applauding right along with the rest of them. That broke my heart. And it also let me know how much work there is to be done to help all people be seen as people, all deserving and worthy of love. And so I know even more that God is calling me to live my life as a woman, to try to normalize the experience of transgender people so that we can get onto the business of loving one another instead of hurting each other. Thank you, Rebecca, for letting me talk today.
Oh, it's been amazing. So, what is it do you see? What do you see for your future?
I hope, my wife and I are figuring out right now who's going to continue going to our church. It's about 30 minutes away from our house. The reason we chose to go there is because I went around and interviewed every pastor within a 30-mile radius to find out where I could find a church that would be okay to invite my gay sons to attend, where they could be assured that they weren't going to be vilified. Plus, my grandson attends that church. He has two dads. I don't want him confused about whether it's okay for him to love his dads. So I went around and interviewed every pastor to find out where they were. And I found this pastor who is in the same place I was for 20 years. I don't know. And so his commitment to us is, you'll never hear me talk about it. And you won't see anything published about it in anywhere on our church website or anything. The only thing I will tell you is I'm not at a place where I can do gay weddings. And I just want you to know that. And so we took a risk and have been going for the last 18 months. And now we're trying to figure out who will continue to go. We're about 30 minutes away. So there's a lot of closer churches that my wife could go that don't involve the possibility of me being around. So if she decides to stay, then I'll go somewhere else. If she decides to leave, then I'll stay there. And my hope is that I'll be able to approach the pastor and ask, hey, what do you think about me transitioning in front of the congregation? They know me as a man. This would be an opportunity for them to actually figure out how they want to handle this. Our pastor has said that he knows without a doubt that the church has failed in its response to LGBTQ people, but he's also very honest in saying, I'm not sure what success looks like. So that's my hope. If it doesn't happen there, then I'll start my rounds again with the pastors in the area and see if anybody else wants to take on that risk. It's an enormous risk because people will leave, people will stop giving simply because somebody who loves Jesus shows up looking different than the body they were born in. And it doesn't make sense to me, but everybody's doing what makes sense to them. And so I get that there's a high cost to this. It's also the only way that, the conversation can change, the churches can change, the Christians can change.
Yeah.
And so that's what I hope to be able to do going forward.
Yeah, and the sense that I got from you is that this is really urgent. So, is there anything more you want to say about why this is so urgent right now?
I guess I didn't realize just how polarized the conversation was until I sat in that church service and listened to this pastor vilify me. I mean, there's just no way to say it. And then I was sitting at my wife and I went to Myrtle Beach for our 47th anniversary. We were sitting in a timeshare presentation because that's how we were able to do the trip. And I do what I always do, mentioned that, I work with parents of LGBTQ kids, and the person's response was, well, this is a crazy world. And I thought initially that he was saying that, well, why wouldn't parents love their kids regardless of, how they identify? But I decided maybe I should clarify that. And so, well, what do you mean by crazy? He said it's this LGBTQ RSTUV thing has just gotten totally out of control. And I very politely said, well, it sounds like maybe you don't know too many LGBTQ people. And then his response was, well, that's just what I believe. And I realized there's a whole lot of people who have lots of ideas about what it means to be trans or queer or gay. And it's because they don't know anybody.
Yeah.
Well, how are they going to know somebody if I'm sitting quietly at home and the only people who ever get to see me are there people who are already in the choir, so to speak?
Yes, exactly.
My life, and so that's my goal.
And thank you for being willing to share your story publicly here. And so I guess I just want to ask you a final question. What do you want people to know about Jesus Christ?
I want them to know that he loves them unconditionally and forever. We were talking to our grandson. We read the Bible and pray with him every Saturday night when he comes over to spend the night. And we were talking to him about, every week we ask him, hey, what's the one thing that God wants us to do? And he's gotten to the point now where he just rolls it off his tongue. Love your neighbor as yourself. And we talked a little bit further about that and said, do you know that means that love never ends? And his eyes got really big and he said, really? And it was very obvious that already at 8 years old, he was feeling conditional love. The idea that unless he was behaving a certain way, living a certain way, being a certain way, that maybe there might come a time when love might be withdrawn. And it was really wonderful to be able to say to him, we love you unconditionally. There's absolutely nothing that will ever change that. And I happen to know where that love comes from. It comes from Jesus. And that's why I would love people to know, especially fellow members of the queer community who have been told over and over again that God's love is conditional. As long as they don't live who they are, it's not true.
Thank you so much for sharing, Grace. And thanks everybody for watching. Please, feel free to leave a comment, ask a question. And if you need resources, if you are LGBTQ and you're wrestling with that, maybe you've been rejected by the church, we want you to know that God loves you just as you are. Grace, thank you so much for sharing your story. It was such an honor to have you on.
I really enjoyed this opportunity, Rebecca. And I just want to say, grace is for you always. Thanks again.
Thank you.
His own self for heavenly food.